One saying I've heard a lot on this app when people are discussing Christianity's connection to racism and intolerance is there's no hate like Christian love. And if we look at the history of European colonization and their interactions with indigenous people, we can add another phrase. There's no violence like Christian peace. Now, I want to preface this video by saying that in no way am I attacking modern-day Christians. I simply want to point out how Christianity has been used and abused throughout history.
White churches have not just been supported by white supremacy, they have served as its headquarters. I know you don't want to hear that. They have taught white people that oppression is godly and that power belongs to us.
Religion is often seen as a source of peace, hope, and unity. But for millions of Africans, religion, especially Christianity, was turned into a weapon, a tool of oppression, a strategy of control. This is the untold story of how religion was used against black people. Watch and pay attention, and I'll share my thought later.
One saying I've heard a lot on this app when people are discussing Christianity's connection to racism and intolerance is there's no hate like Christian love. And if we look at the history of European colonization and their interactions with indigenous people, we can add another phrase. There's no violence like Christian peace. Now, I want to preface this video by saying that in no way am I attacking modern-day Christians. I simply want to point out how Christianity has been used and abused throughout history. Even though I'm not a Christian, I've read the Bible and I love the message of Jesus. In fact, I think if more people had actually followed his teachings throughout history, then the world would be a better place. But the truth is, too often Christians did not act Christ-like. They acted like devils trying to create hell on earth. One of the greatest ironies and tragedies in history is that a religion that was supposed to be built on love, forgiveness, and peace has been responsible for aiding in some of the greatest crimes in human history, including slavery, imperialism, war, and the extermination of indigenous peoples. From the very beginning of European colonization, Christianity played a leading role in justifying the violent theft of indigenous land. After Columbus made his first voyage to the Americas in 1492, the following year, Pope Alexander issued the Doctrine of Discovery, which gave Spain exclusive ownership rights over the lands that Columbus discovered. The Pope declared that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers. He said that barbarous nations must be overthrown and brought to the faith. Therefore, the Pope was giving away land that he had never been to and was already occupied by tens of millions of people. But since they weren't Christians, the Pope believed that they had no right to claim any land as their own. After Columbus made his voyages to the Americas in the 1490s, wave after wave of Spanish conquerors called conquistadors came to this new world to find their fortune and glory. By 1513, all Spanish conquistadors were mandated to read out a document to any indigenous people they proposed to conquer and enslave. The document required indigenous people to acknowledge the church as the ruler and superior of the whole world, and said that if they converted to Christianity, we shall receive you in all love and charity. However, if they refused to convert, these conquerors said, I certify that with God's help, I will advance powerfully against you and make war on you wherever and however I am able, and will subject you to the control and obedience of the church and of their majesties, and take your women and children to be slaves. And as such, I will sell and dispose of them as their majesties may order, and I will take your possessions and do all the harm and damage that I can. Here's a drawing from that time period showing how the Spanish punished native converts who abandoned Christianity. I guess they forgot that part where Jesus said, love your enemies and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas wrote a book in 1542 about the violence he'd seen the Spanish inflict on the indigenous people in the Americas, he made sure to emphasize that these were Christians who were acting like devils. He wrote that, At a conservative estimate, the despotic and diabolical behavior of the Christians has, over the last 40 years, led to the unjust and totally unwarranted deaths of more than 12 million souls, women and children among them. The reason the Christians have murdered on such a vast scale anyone and everyone in their way is purely and simply greed. They have set out to line their pockets with gold and to amass private fortunes as quickly as possible. He then chronicles the horrors that the Spanish brought to the indigenous people of Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, and Haiti. He describes how on one occasion, a troop of soldiers on a pillaging expedition happened upon a mountain region where a large number of natives had sought refuge from the reign of terror the Christians were conducting in their towns and villages. Taking the fugitives by surprise, they carried off 70 or 80 women and young girls. The soldiers stuck their swords into the guts of the women and the young girls, massacring every single one of them. The native men, beside themselves with grief and tearing at their own flesh, shouted after them, saying, "O wicked men, O cruel Christians." Las Casas said that the Spanish were so harsh and so brutal that nothing is more odious nor more terrifying to the indigenous people than the name Christian. He argued that these so-called Christians only deserve to be called demons and devils. When the Spanish began colonizing California, they set up a series of Christian missions, which were supposed to be places to promote Christianity among the native populations. However, in reality, they turned out to be brutal and oppressive prisons of torture and misery. The missionaries wanted people to tend the land, so they captured indigenous people, baptized them, and then held them as captive laborers for the rest of their lives. If any indigenous person tried to run away, they were hunted down and brought back to what was essentially slavery.
White churches have not just been supported by white supremacy, they have served as its headquarters. I know you don't want to hear that. They have taught white people that oppression is godly and that power belongs to us by divine right. After the civil rights movement, powerful white people, men, saw that their grip was slipping. Black people were winning court cases. Poor people were organizing. Women were demanding rights. How dare we? LGBTQ people were coming out of their closets, and the foundations of white male dominance were cracking. So they thought, what can we use that no one will question? In 1979, Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority. He said it was about championing family values. That was a lie. The real trigger was that the IRS had begun revoking tax exemptions for whites-only Christian schools. Those whites-only schools were created specifically to avoid integration. Falwell's own school, Liberty Christian Academy, was one of them. The platform of the Moral Majority ended up getting built around the issue of abortion. Although that wasn't the original plan, they basically test drove different topics to see which ones would resonate the most with the audience they needed to capture, which was white Americans, white Christian Americans. It had everything to do with maintaining the right to discriminate, yet still enjoy government benefits. This guy named Paul Weyrich, who was a conservative political strategist, he teamed up with Falwell to build a political base. He admitted that abortion had not really motivated white evangelicals until it became politically useful. Their real grievance was losing control over who could sit in their classrooms, walk into their churches, and live in their neighborhoods. Once they realized that abortion could mask their racial panic, they made that their headline issue. They built a movement that turned pulpits into propaganda platforms. Sunday services became political strategy sessions. That's illegal. You're not supposed to be able to do that at a church if you're getting tax exemption. Ministers told white families that their enemies were not the wealthy elites exploiting their labor. They were not the politicians cutting their wages and stealing their pensions. The churches pointed to the poor. The black, the brown, the queer, the immigrant, those people are the ones that are taking food out of your children's plate.
Indigenous people like the Tongva were constantly rebelling against these missions all throughout the 1700s, showing that they had no desire to be exploited for their labor or Christianized. When white Americans began to invade California in the 1800s, up to 16,000 Native Americans died in what scholars appropriately call a genocide. But this was just one small part of a wider genocide that took the lives of millions. European colonization of the Americas was one of the deadliest and most destructive actions in human history. From 1492 to 1600, European colonization caused the deaths of 56 million indigenous people who died from either violence or disease. Over this century of suffering, the indigenous population of the Americas was reduced by 90%. So many people died that it actually had an impact on the climate of planet Earth. Researchers have found that this large-scale depopulation resulted in vast areas of agricultural land being left untended, allowing the land to become overgrown with trees and other new vegetation. And this regrowth soaked up enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to actually cool the planet. Europeans and Americans had no problem with this massive death toll because they felt that every indigenous person that died from violence or disease was an act of God. When French invaders began taking over indigenous land in North America and spreading deadly diseases that wiped out entire native communities, one French settler wrote, "It appears visibly that God wishes that they yield their place to new peoples." When the English Puritan John Winthrop arrived in New England in 1630, he said, "The natives, they are all dead of smallpox. The Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess." In his journal, the New England governor William Bradford wrote, "The plague is from the good hand of God, which favored our beginnings by sweeping away great multitudes of the natives that he might make room for us. The epidemic left the land without any people to disturb our free and peaceable possession thereof, from which we may justly conclude that God made the way to effect his work." When Americans began invading the West, they used Christianity to justify their right to take indigenous land. In 1845, the writer John O'Sullivan coined the phrase manifest destiny to describe the idea that God wanted white Americans to take control over indigenous territory. He said that Americans were on a divine mission to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given for the development of the great experiment of liberty. To justify stealing indigenous land, all Americans had to do was turn to their Bible, which told them, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." In 1846, the Senator Thomas Hart Benton explained, "It would seem that the white race had alone received the divine commandment to subdue and replenish the earth, and the indigenous peoples had no right to the land of the Americas, because the land had been created for use by the white races according to the intentions of the Creator." Throughout history, there has rarely been anything more terrifying than someone claiming to be doing God's work and obeying God's commands, because too often God has been used to justify the worst atrocities imaginable. And too often it's been Christianity that's been used to condone these crimes. Too often we realize that there's no hate like Christian love, and there's no violence like Christian peace.
During the transatlantic slave trade, enslavers used carefully selected Bible verses to justify slavery. Scriptures like Ephesians 6:5, "Slaves, obey your earthly master with respect and fear," were read to African captives, while verses about liberation and justice were hidden from them. Enslaved people were not allowed to read, but what they were taught was a version of Christianity that made them submissive, obedient, and silent in the face of cruelty. Long before colonization, African society had rich spiritual traditions, Ifa, Voodoo, Kemetic practice, and ancestral veneration, but European missionaries branded this as demonic or primitive. They convinced Africans to abandon their gods and embrace the white man's religion. To destroy a people, you first erase their spiritual foundation. And that is exactly what happened. Culture, language, and identity were wiped away in the name of salvation. In colonial Africa, the church worked hand in hand with the empire. Missionary schools did not teach reading, they taught submission to European authority. They trained Africans to think white was right and everything African was wrong. Christianity was used to pacify resistance. Rebellious were labeled as sinful. Leaders who stood up were branded as rebels against God. Religion was no longer just about heaven, it was politics dressed in holy robes. Black people were taught to seek God in white skin. Jesus was portrayed as a blue-eyed European, while Satan and sin were often depicted in dark shades. This visual messaging taught generations to associate whiteness with divinity and blackness with evil. Even today, many black people still carried internalized shame about their roots, their culture, and their skin. That did not happen by accident, it was engineered. But religion was not only used for oppression, it also became a space for resistance. Black churches bettered freedom fighters, civil rights leaders, and Pan-African thinkers. Faith became fire. From Harriet Tubman to Desmond Tutu, from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King Jr., black people reclaimed their spiritual power and used it to fight for justice. The truth is this: religion is not evil, but it was weaponized, and until we confront how faith was manipulated against us, we can never fully heal or reclaim our spiritual sovereignty. Thank you for watching, guys. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.